So right around a year ago, the church made the decision to lower the age to start coming to youth group to 6th grade. And to be honest, I was not a fan of that idea. The group more than doubled in size overnight, which changed the entire dynamic of our group because there were more younger kids than older kids. But we also learned very quickly that a lot of growing up happens between 6th and 7th grade, so the chaos level rised dramatically. If I'm being honest, at the time, I was already not having a great time at youth group because of things that had happened in my own life earlier in the year. So to make a long story short, I really didn't want to go to youth. I had talked to my dad about maybe not coming anymore, and when I did come, as soon as I got home, I would give my sister Grace a debrief of how bad youth was and how much I did not want to go back. Then, my dad came to youth one Wednesday evening and announced that a friend of his named Jared invited our group to go to this youth conference his church was hosting. I thought it was at least something different from the normal, and it would be a chance to meet some new people, so I allowed myself to get excited. Which was totally a good call, because we went to No Coast, and it was amazing, at least for me. Apparently a couple other kids from our group thought it was a little loud, but I thrive on loud, so it was like right up my alley. Probably the biggest thing that happened at No Coast, though, was my dad got some inspiration of what our youth group could be like. So the next Wednesday after the conference, during small group time, my dad took me, Nation, and Eve, and we went to Burt's to get slushies. He told us he wanted us to become a youth leadership team. I would also like to point out that slushies were totally used as a bribe to get us to do what he wanted. But it worked, so it's okay. Anyways, he told us that being youth leaders would mean a couple different things. We would help with worship, games, maybe like some setup and tear down. But the most important thing that we would do is we would help make the environment like upbeat and fun. What he didn't say, though, at the time was that we would eventually have to stand up and preach sermons in front of all the big kids, so that's not cool. Really, none of us wanted to do this, but my mom said we had to. And as Josiah said a couple weeks ago, you don't say no to my mom. So here we are. But so Nation, Eve, and I are going to be speaking from the same era of Israel's history that April and Josiah spoke about the first 2 weeks of this series, the transition of power from judges to kings. And as teenagers, we will someday be sitting out there in the grown-up seats. We hope to see what the Bible says we need to be ready for that day when the power of church leadership will shift from your generation to ours. Today I'll be reading from 1 Samuel 3, verses 1 through 14. One night, Eli, who was almost blind by now, had gone to bed. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was sleeping in the tabernacle near the ark of God. Suddenly the Lord called out, "Samuel." "Yes," Samuel replied. "What is it?" He got up and ran to Eli. "Here I am. Did you call me?" "I didn't call you," Eli replied. "Go back to bed." So he did. Then the Lord called out again, "Samuel." Again, Samuel got up and went to Eli. "Here I am. Did you call me?" I didn't call you, my son," Eli said. "Go back to bed." Samuel did not yet know the Lord because he had never had a message from the Lord before. So the Lord called a third time, and once more Samuel got up and went to Eli. "Here I am. Did you call me?" Then Eli realized it was the Lord who was calling the boy. So he said to Samuel, "Go and lie down again. If someone calls you again, say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went back to bed. And the Lord came and called as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel replied, "Speak, your servant is listening." Then God goes on to give Samuel a message for Eli and all of Israel. In this passage, Samuel keeps hearing his name being called. "Samuel, Samuel." The weird thing is, God's voice was coming through loud and clear. Like Samuel's hearing was fine. but a connection still wasn't happening. There was literally only one problem. Samuel didn't know how to recognize God's voice. I think we all sometimes wish God would speak to us more clearly. But this passage makes me wonder if maybe God is speaking all the time and we just don't recognize his voice. So Samuel does the only thing he knows how to do. He turns to Eli, the adult in charge. And the beautiful part of this message is that Eli doesn't tell Samuel to ignore all the other voices and to only obey him. Eli also doesn't tell Samuel what God is saying. Eli had the wisdom simply to tell Samuel that the voice he was hearing was God's, and the smart thing to do was answer. My parents have always told me that God has a plan for my life. They've always told me that I'm a leader and that God wanted to use that characteristic in his kingdom. I've never really listened to them because they usually tell me that means I am going to have to learn how to lead well, and yelling at my siblings to get them to do what I want isn't really leading well. But over the last year, since God started moving in our youth group, 3 different adults, none of whom go to our church, none of whom know each other, and none of whom were trying to get me to stop yelling at my siblings, all told me that I have leadership qualities and a magnetism that God is going to use to help lead my generation to him. 3 different adults who barely know me, and they all see some quality in me that led them to give me the same message and to urge me to use my gifts for God. And there's nothing I want to do more than to serve Jesus with the gifts that he's given me. But I find myself in the same place as Samuel, and I know a lot of other kids do too. We find ourselves in the place where we need godly adults to point out to us when we are hearing God speak. We don't just need to hear adults tell us we're awesome. I mean, we do, because we're pretty awesome, but we don't just need adults to tell us that we're the future of the church. We don't just need adults to tell us what God is saying. We need someone to teach us to hear God's voice for ourselves. Samuel was serving God as a child, just like many of us teens here at Open Table do downstairs. He was fully committed and no doubt gifted. But everything changed in his life the night that Eli told Samuel how to recognize God's voice. I think that's what teens need today. In fact, I think that's what we all need today. My favorite change that has taken place in our youth group over the past year is the way that we've grown inseparable. Before camp this past summer, I could tell that if we were going to have an amazing time, I was probably going to have to just dive in and drag everyone else along with me. So that's what I did, and it worked. By the second night, we were all in, and from that point on, everything we did together as a whole group. If one kid wanted to do something but was nervous, then we all did it with him. And if one kid, I won't say who, but if one kid wanted to go to the church early to have a dance party, yeah, it might have been me. I might have been that one kid. But then we all went up early to have a dance party. Our entire group has changed, and the change stuck, as you can see right here. That is them. A few weeks ago, we went to Dennis Kishler's house for a special service he was having. And the guest speaker preached, and at the end of the service, he asked if anyone wanted to go up front to be prayed over. We had a few kids who wanted to be prayed for, but were shy and nervous. Several people looked to me, and I won't say I heard God say, "Becca, Becca," like Samuel did, but I did know that leaders lead, and maybe I felt God nudging me to do just that. So I looked down our row, everyone else was looking at me, we all nodded our heads, and our entire group stood up and walked to the front. Because we are Open Table Community Church Youth Group, and that's how we do things. So what we really need for godly adults like you is to teach us how to hear God's voice.
You good? Deep breath.
This one goes forward and this one goes.
So, I'm actually going to be talking about a lot of the same things Becca did. As Becca said a little over a year ago, our youth group was really pretty small, and it was mostly full of weird homeschool kids, and I was pretty much the only cool one. So when Chris came up with the idea that Becca, Eve, and I should start the youth leadership team, to be honest, I thought only if Eve does it. But Becca's right. Bribing us with slushies was a pretty low move. But the youth leadership team was actually pretty good. We started leading worship, we led games, gave announcements, and mostly we tried to get everyone to interact with each other. But as the months rolled on, we still weren't where we wanted to be as a group. So when my dad and Chris started announcing that we were going to go to youth camp with Greenhouse Church over the summer, we started getting excited and a little nervous. We raised money and listened to Chris pump up how awesome camp was going to be, and every single week until July finally came, and we all loaded up to head to Branson. As we traveled, all was normal. The same people hung out with the same people, and the same people avoided the same people. Until the second night of camp, something happened that night, and it changed everything. We knew something weird had happened when the night service was over, and we didn't want to leave each other. We had been driving around in 2 vehicles, but on the way to the condo from the convention center, instead of splitting up into multiple vehicles, we all wanted to ride together. So we piled into the big white van, which means half of us were sitting on the floor, and we played songs through the stereo system, and we all sang songs together at the top of our lungs all the way back to the condo. The entire van was shaking back and forth as we sang and bounced and laughed. When we got back to the condo and gathered for small group, Chris was crying as usual. and he told us that what he and my dad had been praying for almost a year was finally happening. We were finally becoming a people. Well, the passage I'm reading today is familiar. Saul was king, and a Philistine giant was making fun of the Israelite army. Everyone was terrified. David had brought lunch to his brothers on the battlefield, and he heard the giant teasing Israel and Israel's God. David couldn't believe what he was seeing and hearing. He stepped up to defend the name of God. "Don't worry about this Philistine," David told Saul. "I'll go fight him." "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth." But David persisted. "I have been taking care of my father's sheep and goats," he said. "When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do this to the pagan Philistine too. For he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine." Saul finally consented. "All right, go ahead," he said, "and may the Lord be with you." We all know the story. David used his trusted sling, and he killed a giant and became famous for it. And as you read through the story, the one thing that jumps out at you over and over again is the way no one thought David was old enough to fight at all, let alone a giant. David's dad made David stay home and play messenger boy between him and David's brothers. David's brothers yelled at him for even asking questions and teased him for being a little shepherd boy. Saul told David he was too small, and Goliath teased David for being young. And David proved everyone wrong. David was ready to fight. As Becca said, our youth group went to a service at Dennis Kickler's a couple weeks ago, and our entire group went up for prayer together, because that's how we do things. The part Becca left out was the guy had preached a really long sermon before the prayer part about how our generation is under attack like no generation in history, and God needs people to rise up and fight. He even kept saying that God just needed one brave young person or two. So when our entire group showed up at the front of the service all together, the guy looked at us, and it was like he completely rethought his idea that it only takes one brave kid. He looked at our group and told us that we were better together. He said we have something special and we have an incredible power when we are together. He said he believed our group could fight the enemy and change the world. David took on a giant all by himself, but that's not how our group works. We take on our giants together. In fact, Chris first planned this service. He was going to have us sit in the normal seats while the other ones preached, and we told him we would only do it if we could stay up here together. And also, I'm pretty sure Becca chose the preaching order because the three of us lead worship together on Wednesday nights, and she keeps on trying to name our band Reverse Oreo. It's like, but just like Becca said, we need adults to teach us how to hear God's voice. We also need adults to give us a fight to win. No one trusted David to fight because he was too young. David had to convince Saul that he was ready, and David won. You would think that the special speaker from a few weeks ago would have scared us by telling us that our entire generation was under attack from Satan. But it actually pumped us up and made us feel needed and important. We are ready to fight. Point us to the battle. It's your shirt.
This is my emotional support seal, if you could divert your attention to him. Thank you, nation. Since three of us telling the same story about like camp and no coast and the service at Dennis's would get really boring, and since I got picked to go last, I figured I should probably tell a different story. So this past late winter and into summer, I got really into the show Alone. And it's pretty much this show where 10 people get sent out into like the extremely harsh elements, and the last one to tap out wins. And I had the same reaction that I'm pretty sure every other person alive has when they watch that show. I thought, yeah, I could totally do that. So for fun, I started building little shelters with whatever I could find laying around. And once I got pretty good at building shelters, I started learning other survival skills. Finally, I built up to solo camping, and if you know me, I used to be scared of my own shadow. I was the kid that would have mom and dad pick them up halfway through a sleepover and ask them to come take me home so I could sleep in my own bed. So sleeping alone outdoors was a pretty big step, and it actually went really well, and I was ready to learn more. I kid you not, in my free time, I would sit at the table and look up YouTube videos on how to survive in the wild, and I was filling up notebooks full of notes. But I was having a blast learning all these new skills, and I was proud of myself, but I knew something was missing: food. I knew I could never make it as a survivalist if I couldn't find food, and what I always wanted to do was catch a fish. And though I had tried several times, I simply couldn't do it. The problem was I didn't want to use any real fishing equipment. I wanted to catch a fish the way I would have to if I was stranded in the wilderness with no supplies. So I found some wire in the garage, because I would obviously have that if I was stranded in the wilderness with no supplies. And I made myself a homemade fishing hook. I found some string for my line, and with my fishing hook and fishing line, I tried everything. I tried to make a fishing rod with a stick. I tried to make a trot line. I tried weaving my string into a net. I even tried making a fish trap that I saw on YouTube, but nothing worked. If I had been in the wilderness, I would have starved. So I keep growing more and more frustrated over whether or not I would be able to survive if I somehow got lost, I don't know, like in our field or something. And every time I would get upset, my dad would say, "You're not going to catch a fish like that. Let me at least get you a real fishing hook." And every time he'd say that, I'd think, maybe he's right. Maybe I do need a real fishing hook. It's possible to get stranded with a fishing hook on your person. But I held firm. I was determined to do it my way, even though I had tried over and over again with no luck. Then one day I made this thing. My homemade hook was on one end, and I tied it to a stick that floated as a bobber, and my string rolled up around the other stick for reeling in whatever I might catch. I put some homemade bait on my homemade hook and threw it out as far as I could, and I reeled it back in. And I did it over and over and over again, and I was having no luck. Until one time I cast out, and I immediately got a bite. And I froze, because I didn't really think I'd get to this point, and I was totally unprepared. I didn't have a clue what to do. But I finally came to my senses, and I reeled it in on my little stick, and I pulled it on shore. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, I'm a survivalist. I'd been working for this fish for so long, and I'd finally caught it. And my second thought was, ew, because in all my research, I had learned that bluegill pee as a defense mechanism when you catch them. So I cast out a few more times just for fun, not really caring if I caught anything or not, because I had already proven myself. But I catch a few more fish that blew my little bluegill out of the water. This was before I figured out how to hold a fish. I was still scared of their teeth. But the main lesson I learned from my whole fishing experiments is that fish are kind of gross, and I don't like touching them. So let's jump right into the passage for this morning. Becca talked about when the baton was passed from Eli to Samuel, and Samuel passed the baton to David, who defeated the giant, as Nation taught us. And in 1 Kings, David passes the baton to Solomon. I'll be reading from 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 5 and 10. You can follow along if you'd like. That night the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "What do you want? Ask, and I will give it to you." Solomon replied, "You showed great and faithful love to your servant my father David, because he was honest and true and faithful to you. And you have continued to show this great and faithful love to him today by giving him a son to sit on his throne. Now, O Lord my God, you have made me king instead of my father, David, but I am like this little child who doesn't know his way around. And here I am in the midst of your own chosen people, a nation so great and numerous they cannot be counted. Give me an understanding heart so that I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom. Just before this passage, Solomon's dad, David, handed Solomon the whole kingdom. On top of that, David had personally told Solomon to build a temple and left him in charge of the plans and building materials for this giant temple that David wanted to build, but God wouldn't let him. So Solomon's overwhelmed, and he's feeling pretty self-conscious and stressed. This is too big of a job for him. But just because he's stressed doesn't mean he can shut down. He has a huge job ahead of him. Well, one night when he's taking a little snooze, like I do when I'm stressed out, God comes to Solomon in a dream and says, "What do you want? What can I give you to help you lead my people?" There's nothing worse than being stressed out and deciding to take a nap and then dreaming about the very thing you were stressed about. But Solomon is smart enough to recognize the dream for what it is, and he asks God for wisdom. By a show of hands, if you told your kid they could have anything in the whole world, who thinks your kid is asking for wisdom? Well, that's what Solomon did. He asked for wisdom because he was determined to lead his people well. He was so determined that he turned down an opportunity to have unlimited money, fancy things, or an all-powerful army. He turned these things down because his father had faith in him, and Solomon wanted to live up to that vision. David had spent a large portion of his life while he was king making plans for a temple that he wouldn't even live to see. But David had enough faith in his son that he believed Solomon would be able to carry on his life's work. So adults, what do we need from you? What do we need in order to take the baton and carry it into the future? We need you to be our David. We need you to have enough faith in us to give us a big job to do. When you hand the church over to us, and we need you to believe that we can lead God's people in the right direction. We need a job so big that we have no choice but to pray for wisdom in order to do it well. Because let's be honest, the revival that this world needs, the big moment of God that everyone is searching and praying for, could be like David's temple. It could be something that you prepare for but don't get to see. So it's your job as the adults of the church to train us and believe in us so that we have the same determination and faith that Solomon did. And when we do stumble and face roadblocks and get completely overwhelmed and frustrated, instead of stepping in and offering us a real fishing hook, we need you to point us to God, who gives wisdom to those who seek it and equips us to do his work well.
I had in my notes to ask you guys to give them a hand, but they do awesome or what? Gee, Christmas. The one thing I didn't think about this month is that my job might be at risk. So how do we respond to this? These ladies were super nervous about this, and they worked really hard at it. So I'm crazy proud of them. I hope you are too, because you guys are a huge part of this through the way you honestly put up with some of the chaos around here. Like we allow a little more chaos than some, and we give them a little more leash than a lot of places, and you guys have to put up with that. And that's I hope you know that it leads to good things. That we are super invested in our kids, and I think these girls are great leaders who are really helping out our group. But I know I've told this story in here before. But in the 2000 Summer Olympics, and I'm sure everybody remembers that like it was yesterday. The United States women's 4x100 relay team was the fastest relay team in the world. All the four fastest women in the world, like single event women in the world, were all on the same relay team. They were the fastest team on the planet. And they were all on the same team, and there was no team on the planet that could beat them. Everybody knew it. Everybody else was playing for second place. They had more speed, more talent, more ability. There was not another team that expected to beat them. They took bronze. The Bahama relay team and the Jamaica relay team both beat them. And losing to those two other teams had nothing to do with speed, talent, and ability. Not even the teams that won felt like they should have won. Everybody knew. And there was no question that the U.S. team had all the speed, talent, and ability. They were faster, more talented. So why'd they lose? The answer is sloppy exchanges. As people have gone back and watched and analysts and how you become an Olympic relay analyst. I have no idea. I don't know what job that is, but almost every analyst says sloppy handoffs. They did a poor job with the baton. They all ran super fast and they tripped over the exchanges. Who realizes that God's kingdom is and always has been a relay? And we have this tendency to forget that. And we think it's about us. We think it's about this time. We think it's about what's happening right now. But it's always been a relay. It's always been about handing it off well. In fact, if you have a vision for the church or for the kingdom of God that isn't so big that it requires you to think about how you're going to hand this off, then that vision is too small. It's too small. You need a bigger vision. For most of us in this room, the greatest impact we can have on this world for the kingdom, with however many years we have left, the absolute greatest impact we can have is to invest in kids. I'm too old to rock this world, but I can invest in kids who can. We need to help young people recognize when God is speaking to them. We don't need to tell them what God says. We need to say, that's God talking to you. You should listen to that. That's God speaking to you. You should respond. We need them to have a great fight to fight. We need to trust them to fight. Because when people don't have a fight, they'll make one up. They'll fight over stupid stuff, all kinds of crazy causes and movements. They'll miss this epic battle that God has called them to because they're bickering over silly things. And we need to give young people a great work to join. We can't just invite kids to come to church and fulfill their moral obligation and learn more and more about the Bible so that they can just get smarter and smarter until they die. Kids need purpose and meaning. They need to know that God called them to this great work, and it will require Nation was right, you guys. That it will require everything from them. They need to know there's something worth spending their life on. So the way that I'd love to respond to this message, this last message of a month of guest speakers, is to recognize what happens in our basement, under the table. That's what Becca wants to name our youth group, Under the Table. Under the Table Youth. Come on. Yeah, can you see the t-shirts?
Somebody needs to let me name everything.
Under the Table Youth. Not happening. But we need to understand that what we do downstairs is not babysitting. It's not getting the kids out of our hair so we can focus. It's not just wholesome entertainment for the kids. It's church. What's happening downstairs is church. God is moving in our kids, and it's beautiful to watch. And this is why we put so much energy and talk lately into everything that's happening with our kids. And you can encourage and foster that move by loving on our kids, serving down in the basement, by smiling when you're at church, like we said, and raising the atmosphere. That was the first job I gave these guys. I was like, we need youth to be fun. The second someone walks in, it needs to feel different. And you three drive that. I'm old. No one's going to, if I stand on the front porch like, what's happening? Hey, give high fives. Everybody's like, ew. But when you guys do it, it's cool. I need you guys to bring up the atmosphere, make it fun. And they took the call. But above all else, pray for our kids. They're taking the gospel into a world that most of us don't understand. Most of us don't even get what's happening out there. And they're tasked with taking the gospel to that world. Pray for them. There's something unique about this generation. There have always been forces that want to get to our kids, that want to control our kids. I mean, I remember my mom complaining way back in the day how they put all the sweet cereal commercials in the cartoon. You know, you're watching cartoons. I'm like, I like Fruity Pebbles. You know, Mom, I want Fruity Pebbles. You know, and she'd get grumpy that they would do that. So the fact that there are people who want to get to our kids is not new. That's been around forever. What's new is never before has that force had a direct voice into our kids' lives. With phones, social media, all the tech, those forces now talk straight to our kids. And we have very little control over it now. So the forces aren't new, the messages aren't new. There's no new thing under the sun. But like never before, those voices have access to our kids. So our kids are in a battle. I do better when they stay with me, yeah. So if you think we can treat our kids like they're not already in a battle, then we've already lost. We need our kids to hear God's voice. We need them to know they're in a fight and that they can fight it. And we need to give them a big job to do, because they're taking the gospel to a world that we can't reach. So as we gather around the table today, even while you're waiting in line and we're singing, pray for our kids. Pray for our youth ministry, our kids' ministries, even our nursery. Get involved with the kids to help give them what they need to succeed as church. And ask God constantly that our kids would rock this world, because this world needs them.